Yeah, I really don't feel worthy. But,
Oh,
Oh, you're very worthy, John. And,
but we're live. So, I'm sorry,
yes,
Josh.
we are live once more with GEO Live number 18. We're here this month. Very special treat for us. We have two guests, John McNamara from the Northwest Cooperative Development Center currently, and Jim Johnson, all-round co-op developer with more than one person, group, I think. And they're going to give us a history of the Democracy at Work network, which they were both co-founders of. And so I will just turn it over to you guys. Take it away.
All right, thanks. Greetings, everybody. I have no idea how many people are watching us, but hopefully somebody is watching us.
We've got 14 right now.
Oh, terrific. Well, welcome to everybody. We're going to start off with at least a few slides to sort of recap the history here, to try to give some framing to the Federation and the project of the Federation that Dawn was, really. U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, John here was on the first board, started in 2004, 20 years ago. This is the 20th anniversary of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, so it's a big deal, and that's one reason we're inspired to do this. And as I understand it, and John may have some additional history here, but in the meeting that founded the U.S. Federation in 2004, there was a set of goals that came out from all the brainstorming that people did for what should the Federation do. And one of those goals was what they called a worker co-op peer technical assistance network. And there's a lot in there. Worker co-ops, peer technical assistance, meaning worker owners helping worker owners. Technical assistance, which we'll get into in a minute, but which means that's a technical term we use about helping small businesses as well as co-ops get started. Whoever's doing the helping is considered to be rendering technical assistance. And then the last word there was network, which indicates a horizontal, decentralized collection of people, as opposed to a hierarchical structure. So you can see in the slide now that was very much encapsulated in our memorandum of understanding. Dawn never existed as a formal organization. We were always umbrellaed, so to speak, as a project of other organizations, especially the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops and the Democracy at Work Institute, which was a 501c3 started by the Federation, not to be confused with the Democracy at Work network, which is what we were. But I will take a moment to recite this, almost like the preamble to our Constitution here, an autonomous, self-regulating, and self-sufficient network of certified peer advisors with strong social and professional ties who cooperate in training themselves and providing technical assistance services to worker cooperatives. Its basic goals are to meet the demand for technical assistance and development advice with high-quality services, and to increase worker cooperative technical assistance capacity from inside the movement. Those are some really key concepts. I want to invite any feedback from John before we move on.
Yeah, actually, it brings up a lot. So at the time in 2004 and really until 2014, I was at the time a member of UNICAB of Madison Cooperative, and at the in 2004, I would say almost all the co-op development community was pretty much focused on either consumer or producer co-ops. When I did training as a board member at UNICAB in 1996, we were the only worker co-op people in the room. Everyone else were farmers. And I remember one director was explaining to us that if you can't agree with the president as a director, it's your duty to resign from the board. That was how they approached, and there was nobody that really understood, like our boards almost always had 5-4 votes. And it was like, well, that's an odd way of looking at it. And there just really wasn't anyone that really understood that uniqueness of worker co-ops, where you have both capital and labor in the same stakeholder group. And consumer co-ops consumers are the owners, and they don't necessarily have the workers' best interests in heart. Likewise with producers, and so it was really important. I think that's why in 2010 on a piece I wrote that ended up in GEO, that this was really something we desperately needed in our community, was co-op developers that actually not only understood the model of worker co-ops, but have a lived experience of being in a worker co-op, and then have a much richer, deeper relationship to just how much work goes into creating a worker co-op and a worker-owned and controlled business.
Thanks for that context, John. I want to add to that because I realize I should introduce myself too. I was also in a worker cooperative when we started on in 2009. I had been there for about 10 years, Sligo Computer Services in the Washington, D.C. area. And we were a conversion, and you'll see that terminology elsewhere in our presentation, meaning the founder of the company made a decision to sell the company to the workers. And the workers bought out the owner and formed a workplace democracy. John, also, thanks for mentioning a little bit on the history of co-op development there, John, because co-op development is a field within many parts of the world, including the United States. And here in the United States, it's largely been rural in its history for about 100 years. And that did present us with cultural challenges as worker owners in worker co-ops, because if you really wanted to freak out the general manager of a food co-op, all you had to do was talk to them about making their consumer co-op a workplace democracy. It was really a very radical notion for almost every co-op in the country to think about actually giving power or ownership to workers. Most co-ops in the country are not workplace democracies. And so that was definitely one of the headwinds. And I think one of the reasons I wound up in the founding cohort of Dawn was because I went through a training to become a co-op developer, a certified co-op developer, through a national organization called Cooperation Works. And we had our trainings in Madison, and that's where I met John for the first time. We toured Union Cab, and I met John McNamara there while I was there getting my training as a co-op developer. So they were just beginning to get, as an organization, Cooperation Works was just beginning to get very interested in worker co-ops at the time. And so it was an exciting time. And that was, there weren't that many certified co-op developers around, and I was a worker owner in a worker co-op who was also a certified co-op developer. And so that, I think, made a difference there. So that's a little bit more history and context. Josh, we lost this slide. We lost the screen share. There we go. Thank you very much. So that relates to what technical assistance is. I'll try not to be too long-winded here, but to continue to frame our story here. Technical assistance is another way of saying helping co-ops get started, co-op development. And it is assistance, and by the technical, they point out to the fact that there are many really relatively technical aspects of starting up a co-op or any small business. There's the legal side of incorporation. There's the financial side of things, setting up your books and, figuring out what the taxes are, writing bylaws. So the screen shows all these different elements that are similar to starting a small business and all the different aspects of starting up a small business. But as worker co-ops, we don't just start a small business, we also create a workplace democracy, a grassroots democracy. And of course, both of those things, starting the business and creating a grassroots democracy, are challenging things. And of course, we're trying to do both of those very challenging things at the same time. Why? Because of justice and sustainability. If you have a worker-owned business or any business that is an economic democracy, it's much more likely to further the causes of justice and sustainability because you've got real humans making real-world decisions on the ground. So this is kind of a little bit ambitious, but as experienced worker owners and getting to the founding of Dawn here, I think one of the really insightful things we realized in the creation of Dawn was, what is the hardest thing to learn in helping people start worker co-ops? It's actually the cultural aspect. Okay, it's like thinking like a worker owner, thinking like a worker, and also thinking like the co-owner of a business. That is the most challenging thing to the success of a worker co-op. So if we're going to provide assistance to worker co-ops, let's start with people who have already learned that. Let's take people who are already worker owners in successful worker co-ops, and let's teach them the other aspects of helping worker co-ops, which are actually easier to learn than learning the culture. There's a lived experience aspect here to worker co-ops that I think bound us together and gave us a kind of zeal, which is very, very difficult for people to understand worker co-ops if they haven't really been worker owners, if they don't have that lived experience of workplace democracy. Your paycheck is dependent upon your workplace democracy. And so there's a very special perspective that comes with that. And it's a critical part of, I think, what made us a special network. John, any thoughts before we move on?
No, not right now.
Okay. So this was one of the things we really didn't know. My recollection of the first couple of years, this was 2009, 5 years after the founding of the Federation, is when Melissa Hoover, executive director of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, she convened, I think it was about 10 of us, John, myself, and about 8 others. And she said, we got to get this thing going. The Federation needs to provide assistance to startup worker co-ops. We're going to take this group of 10 mostly experienced worker owners, and we're going to try to make this happen. And so, yeah, go ahead.
And really, I think we kind of started in 2000. Well, I want to say 2007, 2008. There were meetings. Tom Pearson was part of the group. Ajwa was part of the group. And there were a lot of people. Not all of them went on to become, actual service providers, but we really brought the whole community together to really think what this would look like, and building it from a very grassroots and bottom up sort of method. Yeah, it took, by the time we got to the 2009, I mean, we had really already spent a couple of years in development.
Thanks for clarifying that. I got recruited in 2009 and was not familiar with that process that came before it, the predecessor process. But one of the things that we were talking about was we were trying to do something that I think really, it was very difficult to know the market, so to speak. It was very difficult to know, okay, of all the people who are going to come to us for help, how many of them, if any, can pay for the time we have? How many of them might we be able to get grant money for? Or do we need to get grant money to pay ourselves and just give them the service for free? So we really didn't know this, if I recall correctly, John. We didn't know what to expect when we hung out our shingle. And I believe we spent a couple of years really, training ourselves. The founders cohort, we put ourselves through the first training and the first certification process, which I believe we completed in 2011.
Right.
And we also recruited the second cohort of apprentice peer advisors in 2011, as I recall. And then I believe it was 2012, the U.S. Federation Conference was in Boston that year. And that's, I think, when we really hung out our shingle. We had a booth at the conference. We did workshops. We presented ourselves as an assistance service, the Federation's assistance service, making itself available to the community of both existing worker co-ops, startup worker co-ops, as well as businesses in which the owners were potentially interested in selling to the workers and converting the business to a worker co-op. So that's sort of where we got going, but we really weren't sure what to expect in terms of where the money was going to come from. And in the long run, of course, that became a big issue. We actually entertained the idea that it might be financially self-sustaining without grants for a little while. But I think we were quickly got a reality check on that, and that we always needed grant funding to make it happen, because there was just too many people needing help who didn't have money. Any other thoughts about that or corrections, John?
Yeah,
before we...
I agree. I think also too, because there, had just never been worker co-op focused developers. Co-ops at the time really kind of became do-it-yourselfers and just didn't really see the value in paying outside developers to come in, because when you're getting someone that doesn't really know co-ops. And so I think that was a headwind that we didn't really plan on, that we ran up against kind of a pretty strong culture within the worker co-op world that I don't think exists as much today, of doing it yourself and not really bringing in outsiders.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Lots of different cultural barriers. If you want to go to the next slide, Josh, thank you. So this was a rigorous program. I mean, think of Dawn, two big chunks of Dawn, and one was there was a training program taking mostly experienced worker owners and making them into what we called peer advisors. And then the other was the consulting aspect of it, you know, matching those peer advisors with the needs of startups and worker co-ops in the community. This was a rigorous program, a year long. There were we're scattered around the country, so we had to do a lot of things online. 10 online webinars, 2 in-person weekends, which means people were flying in to someplace from wherever they were, needing to do a research project and needing to do a 40-hour internship. So this was the training program as we knew it. And can you advance the slide, Josh? Thank you. And we decided, if I recall correctly, John, we decided early on this needed to be a certification program. Our experiences as worker owners with the co-op development field not really being tuned into worker co-ops, we were sensitive to delivering high quality assistance, really truly qualified assistance. And so we made this a certification program. And so after going through this year-long training, there was a 50 to 60 minute face-to-face session with each apprentice. We did role plays. We grilled them on things. They had to present a research project, and there was a certification board, basically, that would made up of some outsiders and some Dawn members that would decide they were qualified to become a peer advisor. Any thoughts about that, John?
Yeah, and not everybody was certified after the process. That I mean, it really was something that we all took very seriously, and it was. I think it was really incredible to do that. I mean, because we wanted to make sure that people were really going to be representing us as and doing the work that we were envisioned.
Right on. Okay. Next slide, please.
I will say my project was with the Hub Bike Co-op that just shut down. So sad to see them shut down because personal relationship with that. And we did the co-op index, which I still talk about experience when I'm telling people about the index tool. It's
a shame the Hub shut down. They were around a long time.
Yeah, it's just, the bike industry, the biking industry has just always been a struggle, and it hasn't. After the easing of the pandemic, a lot of bike shops are really seeing what happened to them.
It's rough. Josh, could you back up one slide? I think there might be one in the middle there. And so we didn't just certify. We also realized our field of worker co-op development is evolving so quickly. Peer advisors needed to recertify every 2 to 3 years. So there were requirements for ongoing training. And in order to remain a peer advisor, you had to do some committee work in supporting the governance of Dawn, the organization itself. And there were also a certain number of volunteer hours. Ajwa is asking me, what was my project? I believe my project as a peer advisor was actually to work to support University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives on a website project that they had going on. And so I remember that was big and long and complicated. I honestly can't remember the outcome of it, but that was my internship project, was University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives. Very important, one of our very important think tanks in the co-op movement, and helping them out with a website project they had. So, next slide, please. In order to, so ongoing, part of the ongoing training was what we called 200 level trainings, and John and I served together on one of the committees that was training and certification, and advanced topics. And one of our most fun activities actually was show and tell, where different peer advisors would do a presentation on one of their projects, And then everybody would sort of brainstorm it and workshop it, and what went well and what could have been done better and how could it have been done better. And it was really to be able to talk shop about worker co-op development with experienced worker owners. That was one. We had a lot of special things, but that was one of the most special things, to get together and talk about, just to workshop ideas and issues with each other. When it was so rare, there were so few opportunities to really sit down and talk shop with other experienced worker owners. It was really a special bonding experience, and show and tell is, I think, for me, one of the most fun things. John, any reminiscences you want to share about that?
Oh, geez, it's kind of hard for me to remember all of it, but I know there was there was just a constant, thinking of what else can we be doing in training, and I think we at some level we would have probably even gone up one more level, but we always wanted to see this as a constantly educational process. And keep in mind too that the goal also is that as these are peer technical assistance providers, so that not only are they being trained, but they're bringing tools back into their co-ops that can their co-ops benefit by having them in the organization as well. And so that was always thinking about what more can we be doing was constant. Yeah,
and I will get to governance structure in a minute here, but John just reminded me of something that goes back to actually one of the first slides. The no need to go back to that, Josh, but the idea of building development capacity within the worker co-ops themselves. And it's, to me, an important thing in the whole field of co-op development is experience is the jewel of the realm, really, in co-op development. The more experience you get, the more helpful you can be to co-ops. And it's really that lived experience of being in a co-op, but the lived experience also of helping many different co-ops. It cultivates a brain trust, what I like to call a brain trust. And it's like that brain trust is going to live somewhere, right? And if as worker co-ops, we depend on nonprofit organizations or government agencies or professionals or whatever, if we depend on people outside of our co-ops for the expertise in strengthening and developing our co-ops, then we're going to cultivate a dependency. But if we cultivate that expertise within our co-ops, then we can be more autonomous and independent, as the co-op principle states. Right. We can have that brain trust to ourselves within our movement, so that if the grant funding for co-op development ever dries up, or if we end up with a government that's hostile to cooperatives, for example, as has happened in a number of countries, then we can be independent. We can have our own development capacity, our own depth and breadth of development experience within the co-ops themselves, and we'll be in a much better position to prevail if conditions become unfavorable to us. So to me, that's a critical part of the vision here. We did have a governance structure, even though we were never a legal entity unto ourselves. We called it a board of governors because it wasn't really a board of directors, because we didn't really have a corporation or an LLC. And in addition to a board of governors, we had 3 committees: marketing and outreach, service and evaluation, training and certification. And by and large, the governance structure of Dawn was volunteer, and peer advisors were required to volunteer time within the governance structure. And we also had an intake process that's important. And I'm not sure I gave that much attention in this presentation, but when we had a forum on the USFWC website, anybody who needed assistance could fill out the form. We had some paid staff. We had 10, I believe, we had an intake coordinator at 10 hours a week. And then we had, I believe, an administrative support person who would primarily support the committees at 10 hours a week. And that was maybe not at all points in our process, but I think that was when we were strongest. That's how we sort of divided up the work. And the Board of Governors sort of made policy decisions and coordinated things and helped with coordinating strategy and all, but there was a lot of work that was done in the committees to get the word out to people that we were available to them. Service and evaluation was focused on ensuring the quality of service that the peer advisors were delivering, and training and certification, as we mentioned, was to provide initial training to apprentices, 100 level training, and then 200 level training to peer advisors in an ongoing way to support recertification and ongoing education. It was a lot of work. One of the things I think I would look to improve was we tried hard to come up with a more streamlined governance structure over the years, and we never quite did. And this governance structure, it worked, but it was a lot of effort. John, do you have any reflections on our governance structure and how well it worked or didn't work?
I think it actually worked very well. I think I didn't really have a lot of critiques of it. I think the bigger issues is that we never really had the autonomy that I think we really needed to have, and so there was always a battle for resources and challenges with that. And I should say too, although it's not really part of the governance structure, we also had a very strong commitment to humor and having fun. So, like if you were to say the Board of Governors, you were supposed to refer to governors or greet each other as governor, but with a really bad British accent. Upon certification, people would be given or they would either choose a Don name or they would be given a Don name by the group. And mine was Donnie Marie. I don't know what yours was, Jim. I forget what yours was.
You're embarrassing me because I think I might have forgotten my Dawn name. Actually, I can't remember. Oh my gosh. Okay, that was fun. We're definitely about having fun.
We did not have any secret handshakes, so but I imagine over time that would have probably developed.
I think we would have. And it reminds me, though, I mean, to me, the highlight was, again, when we were strongest, we got together twice a year. Everybody flew in from everywhere. And we had these weekends together where we would conduct business. We would have elections. We would, do certifications. But just hanging out together and going out to a restaurant and, staying in some place that had a hot tub or something, it was just wonderful to be together and to talk shop. And there was this special vibe, even as we were all from, very different parts of the country. There was an esprit de corps that was really one of the highlights of my life, frankly. So It was beautiful. Admin contractor, 10 hours a week. That's the itemization of what the admin contractor did for the committees. Very important. An interesting model too about the tension between volunteer work in the organizational structure versus paid work. And I think one of the strengths that I would say is we didn't have any full-time employee. Everybody who put in paid time, 10 hours a week, the admin contractor and the intake coordinator, they were an active worker owner at the time also. And I believe, and they, they reported to a volunteer board or volunteer committee. And so I think that was one of the strengths that really kept the worker owners, the members of Dawn, stayed in charge because the paid staff responded to the volunteers, basically. I thought that was a potentially very sustainable structure, even as sometimes I felt we were all kind of overworked. But anyway, next slide, please. Intake coordinator. This is a very important position. And intake in general in co-op development is very important and challenging because you're basically scoping the request. Someone's coming to you for help with their co-op or their startup. And you need to sort of have a very global view, and you need to do a lot of listening, and there's a lot of insight that's required. One of the things I really liked about our structure was peer advisors were required to work intake rotations because, in my opinion, it's one of the best ways to get a feel for what's going on out there in the realm of the worker co-ops and the startups, and where are things at? What is the state of the field? You could really get that by doing a couple of months of fielding intakes. And so I felt it was one of the best ways to train peer advisors and to help build that brain trust of knowledge and expertise, is to really, tune in to what's going on with the people in the field. So I'm not sure there's anything else there. Yeah, we would go ahead.
And it's kind of funny because at NWCDC, we're just sort of building now after, 20 plus years, an intake system that kind of doesn't look exactly like this, but we have one person who handles the first call, and then we have a weekly stand-up meeting where the general development team reviews all the intakes, and it helps us keep each other accountable for the process. Also, make sure that we're all seeing what's out there, and so yeah, not thinking about how much I've internalized some of this, but I guess I have.
Yeah, I remember we had a series of flowcharts, weeding out the wackos. Thank you, Hazel. Yeah, we did refer things out. We would get some really wild things. One of the more common things we would get is we would field a call from somebody, and they're like, I really want to start a worker co-op, but I want to have a veto over everything. If the worker owners end up doing something crazy, I need to be able to step in. For them, we're like, well, I'm sorry, that's not a worker co-op. You may want to start a nonprofit organization. We got a lot of things like that where people just didn't get the whole, it really is a democracy thing. So anyway, so
yeah,
go
just
ahead.
a little aside, Aaron Dawson and I had a meeting at the last time the worker co-op conference was in Chicago with this person who they wanted to start a co-op that would do bike pickups of waste oil from restaurants that would then be used to turn into biofuel. And we get through the whole thing of talking with them about it, and then we asked the question, how many people do you have involved? And he says, well, no one. And then we asked him, well, who's going to do this work? And they said, well, we'll find people. And I thought, well, you really should have people that want to do this work.
Yeah.
Riding your bike around picking up waste oil from restaurants cannot be fun in the summertime. And we still get stuff like that where people have a great idea for a co-op, only they don't want to do it. They want other people to do it. So.
Right, and the worker owners will just own it, and then we'll farm out the work to non-owning workers. We actually had an item on our intake form that was for one person with an idea, right? And because we got a lot of that, and I was like, well, you need to have like at least 3 people if you want to start a co-op, frankly. And it was we got a lot of one person with an idea. So it is what it is. The whole population is still learning about what really is involved here. Yeah, you're right. Understanding workplace democracy isn't something society prepares us for. Quite the opposite. I would say we're actively discouraged from exploring workplace democracy, but that seems to be changing too. So a lot of operational stuff on the part of the committees here. Client evaluations were hard to get. It was really hard to get our clients to give us like evaluations about how well we did. Annual peer evaluations. There was one time John and I ended up wrangling, we had a 360 method for a while where every peer advisor got to give feedback to every other peer advisor. And I remember one weekend, John and I ended up with a massive amount of work trying to compile all the different feedback that came in. There was definitely a matter of streamlining systems so that we're mindful of how much labor we're getting ourselves on for. So that's committee work. You can move on if you want, Josh. I should point out one of the most fun things we did was the Ask the Peer Advisor sit downs at conferences. Sometimes it was a booth, sometimes it was just a desk with a couple chairs, but I think that was one of the most engaging and fun things, is to just sit at a conference and people would come up with their questions and you could be there face to face with them. So this was probably one of our busiest and biggest years. 15 active certified peer advisors. We had 4 that cycled out. We did have a fair amount of turnover in peer advisors, mostly having to do with people just going through life changes. We did have a type of membership, professional and co-op development organization members. We wanted to have ties to the larger cooperative movement. That was one of our motivations there. And they represented an important resource for us, as long as they really got worker co-ops, which there are co-op developers and other allies who have never been worker owners, but they do understand worker co-ops. Those people are out there. Working pro members, a lot like I became, I left my worker co-op in 2009 and became a freelance co-op developer. So I guess I really should have been a working pro member at some point. there were a lot of the training course, the year-long training course was so rigorous. We actually had 17 apprentices who did not complete the course. Another thing I would rethink, would there be an easier way for people to go through the necessary training and become certified? Because we did have what I think is a relatively large number of people falling out of the training before they finished. Any thoughts about that, John?
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely, it could, I mean, if we were doing it today, we'd probably have something that would be more streamlined and maybe more self or asynchronous learning and other types of programs. I think it was, you know, the amount of time that Don was really active was, really, about 5 or 6 years. So we didn't really have enough, I think, time to really sort of do a shakedown cruise and make new iterations. I think that would have happened, and we probably would have, had we had enough time to really, build that sort of experience and knowledge.
Yeah, right on. So a ton of co-ops here. These and it includes some of the biggest and oldest co-ops in the country at the time. Some of y'all may recognize some of the names here. Yeah, go ahead to the timeline, unless you have something you want to reflect on with that previous slide, John.
No.
So this is the rough timeline, and I may need to stand corrected on this. John's memory may correct me on some of this, but we got going there. That 2013 to 2016, I would call the peak years. Interesting to know how much activity we did, but I think the maximum budget we ever had was $50,000. I don't think we ever cost more than that, and I think that delivers a lot of bang for the buck, considering we had, I think in that year, we had about 15 active peer advisors, the training program, everything that was going on, working the conferences, and we still only soaked up $50,000 in grant money. To me, that's in terms of the amount of assistance that we delivered, I think that's an incredibly good value myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, considering, it's not even one full-time employee, really, right? Maybe if you're in a low cost of living area, that's one full-time employee at a co-op development center, maybe, right? So, so in 2018, in 2018, this is a much larger topic. I don't know how deeply we can go into this, but one of the things that happened as the Federation grew, as the Democracy at Work Institute was formed, the 501c3 arm of the Federation, we no longer, as a project of the Federation or as the project of the Democracy at Work Institute, we would have a staff liaison from those organizations. But after a number of years, we lost our direct connection to the decision makers. And so my recollection in 2017, 2018 is we couldn't get a direct access to decision makers as a project. And we couldn't get a budget. We couldn't negotiate a budget. And I understand that, particularly as things evolved, there was a question about, on the one hand, thank you. The funding generally came either through the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops or through the Democracy at Work Institute. And we sort of moved back and forth between those two organizations in terms of who our parent organization actually was. Often our money would come from USDA has a co-op development grant program. Some of our funding came through that, but it could be challenging to get. I realize it could be challenging to get funding for us. But the main thing that I found was, to me, that where we really struggled at some point was when we could no longer get direct access to the decision makers. We were an autonomous self-governing network, but the U.S. Federation of Co-ops, U.S. Federation, and also Democracy at Work Institute, they needed some sort of accountability. That was a conversation we had a number of times, especially starting in 2016, 2017. What does accountability look like if Dawn is an autonomous self-governing organization? And we would try to negotiate a memorandum of understanding, but it was very difficult and time-consuming to actually settle on the terms of how are we accountable to the Federation while also being autonomous and independent. And it touches on the question of, we never had our own funding stream. We never had our own legal entity. We were dependent upon those two organizations for both of those things. And I believe that was something that, came back to haunt us in the long run. John?
Yeah, I mean, so it started as as a project of Dowie. And then once it stayed a project of Dowie, when Dowie became a 501c3. And then at some point, a decision was made by Dowie and the U.S. Federation for it to go to the U.S. Federation and get off of basically Dowie's books. And that was, I think, probably like 2017. And then in 2018, the Federation killed it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
none of that was done with discussion or support of any of the members of Dawn.
Mm-hmm. Right. It
In
was a
fact,
surprise to us, in fact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think the notice that Dawn was getting shut down, at least the email I got, was the night before the Worker Co-op conference in LA started. So late Wednesday night around 11:30 p.m. Pacific, an email went out saying, by the way, Dawn's done.
Right.
Yeah. That was our notice.
Mm-hmm. Libby Stewart is asking, why didn't you incorporate?
Well, I mean, I don't remember all the reasons at the time. I guess if I had known that, what was going to happen, we probably would have pushed harder for that. I think that would have been the better plan, to have it spin off as its own 501c3 and get its own grants. And if we could have done, as well. I mean, obviously, we showed the accountability thing. I think it was kind of a red herring discussion too, because it's not. We all do grant reporting, and it's pretty easy, to set up a system of reporting and projects, and that wasn't going to be very difficult.
Mm-hmm. The Adwa asked, was a reason given for shutting down Dawn? How did governors respond to that notice? I'd like to take that question in a moment, but to follow up on what John was saying, I think it could have been worked out. But like I say, I remember there being, where the memorandum of understanding that could have addressed the accountability issue, the so-called accountability issue, it would take months to get a response, months to get feedback on that. And like I say, we couldn't get a budget the last couple of years. And so, so we struggled. We were going forward on a volunteer basis. I'm not sure even our intake coordinator or our administrative staff person was even being paid the last year or two. I'm not sure if the peer advisors were being paid, maybe. But my recollection was that I also got that email just before the LA conference. And my recollection, correct me if I'm wrong, John, was they said that the governance of Dawn was failing. And which I didn't think was the case at all, because the Board of Governors was still meeting and getting things done. But it was difficult to get things done without money. But I believe we were still meeting and we were still conducting business and taking intakes and such. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't, of course, on the board at that point, so I was kind of a little bit more removed because, I was full-time co-op developer then. But yeah, it was very vague, and it's kind of sort of setting up a situation where the organization suffers and then says, well, look, it's not working, we have to shut it down. So I think it was kind of a predestined by decisions that were made. And then, the Federation started the co-op clinic, which is just not the same thing, right? I mean, it provides a needed service for sure, but especially in areas of the country where there isn't co-op development with worker co-op experience, but it's just really transactional. It wasn't about the education and sharing information.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fairness to the Federation, I want to try to be balanced here, even though I was very much on one side of the whole process. But that was a big part of the memo that came from the Federation staff, was that they had this larger vision for what they called the co-op clinic, that was not only peer advisors, but also professional developers, partner organizations, and so forth. So that was a big part of their justification, or what you might call a larger vision, for providing assistance. But I felt it really sort of, downplayed or even perhaps eliminated the whole mutual aid ethic that Dawn was, and the autonomous and independent network that Dawn was. It was much more of a federation organ that was probably seemed rather hierarchical. Yes, John, go ahead.
Yeah, and I should say, Dowie also created the Worker Donors Collaborative, which does provide some networking and limited training, but it's also a much bigger tent employee ownership world that includes a lot of these people and employee-owned trust folks as well. So it's not really the same thing.
Yeah. One other thing I would add, and I see a question about what I think about incorporating and reincarnating Don, but to add to what Don just said, another aspect that I think was critical, logistically important, was that, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but when we moved from Dowie to the Federation, Dowie said, we will continue the training program, right? And so and there was one reason I think we didn't incorporate, and one reason we were willing to try leaving the training program with Dowie was capacity, right? My recollection was being very busy. The volunteer commitments were not insignificant, really. And so we were like, okay, Dowie wants to continue to do the training program with the funding that they have. We'll do the apprentice training program through Dowie, but then Dowie terminated that training program after another year or two, if I recall correctly. And that meant that the incoming supply of trained peer advisors was going to dry up eventually. So we discussed incorporating a number of times. As I recall, we sometimes thought, should we become a worker cooperative? But we realized we needed grant funding by that time. It was one of the things we learned was we won't be able to be financially self-sufficient. And an important lesson, I think we will always need grant funding because there's too many people who need help. And we can't take money from other projects to subsidize the people who can't pay. Nowadays, with so many conversions taking place, a little bit about the future here, with so many conversions taking place now where the development project can actually be financially self-sustaining, there might be some feasibility where if you work enough conversion projects, you can generate enough surplus revenue that you might be able to subsidize, no charge support to startups. That might be possible. Then when it comes to reincorporating, starting up Dawn again, I want to touch on that in a minute, but I'd like to finish this thread, if that's okay. John, anything else before?
Yeah, I would also add, in addition to conversions, there's also a stronger willingness of co-op friendly lenders like Shared Capital, Seed Commons, to build in technical assistance as part of the loan agreement. That when you borrow from these lenders, that they're kind of following the Rock USA model, right, where there needs to be some sort of technical assistance agreement in place during the life of the loan. And so that also really changed the landscape. Answering Libby's question real first, I could only really speculate at the real reason. You'd have to ask the executive directors of the Federation and Dowie at the time. And maybe that opportunity will happen at some point.
Yep, that's a good point. The board of governors did respond. Back to Audra's question before we move on. The board of governors did respond to the memo from the Federation staff that basically the memo that declared Dawn governance to be abolished. That's kind of how they did it. I saw them framing as Dawn as being folded into the co-op clinic, but the governance of Dawn was declared, non-functioning, which again, I disagreed with. We vehemently disagreed with that. The Dawn governance is still functioning, in fact. But we also didn't have the capacity to go forward on our own. And this touches on the incorporation question and the resurrection question, which I want to delve deeper into in a minute. But it was, the governors convened a number of meetings after the Federation declared the governance of Dawn to be defunct. We continued to meet. We continued to talk about what to do to go forward. But it was, none of us really had the capacity to do that. And one of the interesting things that went on was a number of us had become more prosperous. Like, we weren't able to pay I think it was $40 an hour. Peer advisors, I believe, were paid $40 an hour for development assistance. And I believe peer advisors got $25 an hour for working an intake shift. And so that was, and we got to a point where people were making more than that in their worker co-ops, some of them. And so they wanted to work for Dawn, but they had to take a pay cut in order to work as a peer advisor, because we couldn't afford to pay more than $40 an hour for peer advisors. And that was as a contractor, so you'd have to pay taxes out of that and so forth. So that was another factor in, like, what's our business model going forward, And we would have to be a 501c3. We would have to chase grants. And that's no small effort. Anybody who runs a co-op development center like John knows that is no small task to actually, pay salaries, create a nonprofit organization, do all the due diligence and paperwork and, taxes and, so forth involved in operating a 501c3, like GEO also operates a 501c3. So it's not a small task to go forward as your own organization. It's really not. And you need this constant inflow of money. And we'd already found out that our business model can't stand alone. We would need to chase serious funding in order to keep it going. Any thoughts on that, John, before we roll on?
I think that's correct. I mean, it would have been a pretty heavy lift, especially because, again, as you mentioned, the members of Dawn were really part-time and had full-time jobs. And so This would be one more thing of trying to do. And it would really require probably hiring a full-time staff person. That was insurmountable. It's just that it was definitely not something that you could do in a crisis, right? I mean, it would have probably taken a couple of years to really pull all that together.
Yeah. So, lessons learned. I really, going forward, I think a lot of the answers to people's questions are going to be, what lessons did we learn here? And things going on in people's lives. We lost a number of apprentices out of the training program because they got pregnant. Actually, there were a number of those. And then even in the final year of Dawn, 3 of our board members had babies. And so people had things going on in their lives, in addition to being full-time with their worker co-op and the time they were putting into Dawn, they had things going on in their lives. We determined 100% fee for service. That is 100%, paid service, not possible. We needed at least $50K funding per year. Like any small consulting organization, there were busy times and slow times. And so there was supply and demand, sometimes it would tend to come in waves. Requests for assistance would tend to come in waves. We would be swamped, then it would be slow, and people would be like, hey, I'm available for project work. I could use the extra money, but there wasn't necessarily any work. So every small consulting firm has that challenge, myself coming from a small IT consulting firm. Capacity issues, full-time worker owners providing assistance on the side. I felt that was a big issue. We might have been able to get better support from regional federations and worker co-ops. There might have been other models, like maybe a full-time worker at a worker co-op. Maybe their worker co-op would say, okay, go down to 32 hours a week, give 8 hours a week to Dawn. There might have been other business models we could have come up with that would have made people's worker co-ops more of a partner in supporting the delivery of assistance to worker co-ops. Those are just some ideas floating out there about, regional federations. More on that in a minute. Next slide for lessons learned. I think there's one more slide here. Yeah. 1 year program might have been too steep. I've been thinking about something more modular or incremental. Tough to get feedback from clients. We should, if we'd created a legal entity early on, we might have worked it out and worked it into our business model so that it could work. We hopped back and forth between the Federation and DAWI. If we'd secured our own funding sources, that might have been a really heavy lift, or who knows, we might have gotten a funder who really believed in us and would give us multi-year funding so we wouldn't have to put the energy into chasing it. A seat at the table where strategy is developed, access to decision makers. We had that early on, and because of changes in the way we related to the Federation and DAWI, we lost that direct access to decision makers. We lost our seat at the table where the strategy was developed. And eventually the strategy became, let's do the co-op clinic, non-governance, is not on the table anymore. So that was, I think that's a big lesson learned for me going forward. Don't lose your access. Don't lose your voice in the strategy development process. Don't lose your access to whoever holds the strings of your budget and your entity.
Yeah, and I think don't assume that their agenda includes you, right?
Yeah.
I think there was a general assumption that we were part of the long-term vision of the national organizations. And at some point that changed, and it's never really, we were never told that until we got the letter.
Yeah, Rebecca, who created that vision? Yep, I hear you. Well, there's definitely bigger questions here about, in my opinion, how do supposedly member-driven organizations continue to be truly member-driven? And I'm anxious about other thoughts on this, but I continue to struggle with the board model, frankly, and I'm not sure I have a great alternative. Sociocracy is an interesting model for me that I've been exploring for quite a while. John actually recruited me into a sociocracy organization in which we're still active, and it's an alternative to board governance that also encourages very much something very similar to a self-directed work team model, a decentralized network of small groups. And so I think there may be fundamental problems with the board model of nonprofit organizations. There's more to it than that, but I think that's one critical factor here is, can you really have a democratic organization where the power is delegated through a representative democracy to a small number of people? John,
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a difficult thing. I mean, it's kind of, classic isomorphism, right? I mean, boards are forced on the
Yes.
co-op world by the law. Yep. Really interesting. Joe Marafino actually sent me the article, but when I was doing my dissertation, it is about the history of where the board of directors comes from. And it was actually came from King James the First of Scotland. And it was basically to protect the investors in the Virginia colony. So the very concept of a board of directors is an artifact of colonialism, and the idea was to protect the investors against the colonists from mismanaging the colony. And you think about that, and here we are, in this radicalized space of worker ownership and control, and we're recreating a colonial structure to govern it. And that's kind of crazy when you think about it. And some co-ops have worked around it. I forget the name of the co-op in Manchester. It's a worker-owned food co-op, and they have 80 members, and so all 80 members are on the board of directors. Smith Engineering does the same thing. All 35 or whatever members are on the board of directors.
Right.
The board becomes de facto a membership meeting, although just when they're meeting for the board issues, it's called a board meeting. So there are ways of undermining boards. And of course, the group in Manchester uses sociocracy, and Isthmus doesn't, but they, their projects are all team projects. So that's how. So they have kind of something that looks and feels like sociocracy.
And the worker-owned co-op grocery in Manchester, is that Abby's organization, Rainbow? Perhaps was it Rainbow? Was it Unicorn?
No, Unicorn. That's really funny though. That when you think about it, because of course Rainbow's the U.S. worker-owned grocery store.
Right, U.S. and San Francisco with a self-directed work team model, Rainbow Grocery in San Francisco.
Yeah, and Rainbow uses it's a network of collectives.
Right, exactly. So there are alternatives to the board model. We have some living examples of that, actually. And there are board models that scale large. Isthmus Engineering, like you say, 80 people, I think, in the board meeting. And yet, my understanding is they meet every 2 weeks and it works pretty well. So there are ways. The conventional wisdom is once you scale up, and you even hear most co-op developers will say this, once you scale up a decision-making body larger than 10 or 15 people, they'll say you have to go to a representative democracy.
Yeah,
because we just can't scale it. But we see there's other models that isn't necessarily true. Yeah.
Right. Seco Sola in Venezuela. I probably butchered their name, but they're a huge cooperative, multi-stakeholder cooperative with thousands of people, and they use consensus and they use the membership meetings, and they just won some international award last year, I think, for their work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's one of the ways we could go forward. I would say that's not the entire reason that Dawn met the fate that it did, but I think there's a substantial amount of that is the governance structures that we use may naturally lend themselves to the disenfranchisement of members at the grassroots level. I think that's a critical lesson learned here. John mentioned isomorphism, which I want to make sure we clarify. John, do you want to give a definition of that? Because I think it's something that affects all of our progressive movements.
Oh, I mean, basically, it is that it's kind of organizational version of entropy, only the opposite. That organizations in a similar field, will gravitate towards what the dominant organization is, and will look like. Sometimes that happens through laws that are enacted, like credit unions are forced to follow banking laws, even though they have a different ethical space. They're still treated as if, and so they end up having to get bigger and bigger and then look like banks. And there's also mimetic, where people are chasing the so-called best practices for their industry, not thinking that best practices are maybe there for shareholders, not for workers. And so as you get bigger and you start talking about best practices, you have to really, if you aren't thinking carefully about it, it's very easy to start looking and acting like investor-owned businesses. And then normative, which is, again, just ways of how you approach the whole work that you're doing. That it's, banks are going to determine success as on your profit and loss statement, not on your meeting your mission. Like at Union Cab, right? Our mission, or the mission of Union Cab, is to create jobs, a living wage or better, in a safe, humane, and democratic environment by providing quality transportation. All of those items on the profit and loss statement would be on the expense side.
Right.
So just by chasing its mission, Union Cab is not meeting the normative standard of what success looks like for a cab company.
Yeah. I want to acknowledge a couple of questions in the chat. Hazel had a question about co-op development training for people in Canada. And yeah, I want to tackle the question of what would the dawn of the future look like? Where is there, someplace we should go for here? Before I move on, I want to credit St. Mary's in, is it university? Sobey School of Business, St. Mary's University, for turning me on to the concept of isomorphism, along with John, and that that's the home of the master's degree in cooperative and credit union management. John may be able to give us an update on that. A very important academic ally in all of this, incredibly important, and where I really got my first in-depth understanding of isomorphism. When I'm training people in co-ops, I try to incorporate isomorphism into it. The way I describe this is we have a tendency to inadvertently recreate the oppressive systems that we are actually trying to escape, because we come from a cultural and organizational and economic context of these oppressive systems. And so we're always at risk for inadvertently recreating oppressive dynamics, even as we try to create liberated organizations. And so there's a sort of an eternal vigilance question here, but there's also a structural question. Do we really need to use board models? to organize our movement? Or are there better ways that may, undermine this tendency towards isomorphism? So I think those are some critical questions to ask. And Hazel clarified her question, I think, where is worker co-op development training happening? Thank you for duplicating that comment, Hazel. I believe that Cooperation Works is now doing a fair amount. Doesn't the Cooperation Works training give a couple of days out of their training to worker co-ops? John, that's my understanding.
Yeah, and definitely they include a lot more worker co-op voices now in their training. And I would say, there's been a real sea change, and part of that is because of overall a lot of changes, right? The baby boomers retiring, making conversions a really big issue now. Worker Toners Collaborative does some training, but it's really specifically around conversions. There's different, I think Rutgers is in partnership with Dowie still to do their School of Management. Is that right?
Right. Dowie has a School of Cooperative Management, School of Democratic Management program. I'm not too familiar with that program, but it seems to have been going for quite a few years.
Our center partners with the Evergreen State College to do a Sustainable Cooperative Development Certificate. And of course, the third quarter is fieldwork. So we pair students with a co-op that is usually a solidarity or a worker co-op, and mentor them through the delivery of technical assistance.
Yeah, and this dovetails into sort of what's in the future. Could a reincarnation of Dawn be feasible? And I would say that what we're leading to here in this discussion is a reflection of how the movement has changed and how the strategy of what we would call peer technical assistance, peer advising, mutual aid, peer-to-peer mutual aid is good question there, Audra. Make sure we don't forget that. Is that I think the future is more local and regional than it is national. Dawn was a national organization, and that was the best thing at the moment because it was the Federation was behind it. The Federation started it, and the Federation is a national organization. My personal hunch is that the future is local and regional, and if we really want to build a strong peer mutual aid networks, plural networks, then we need to focus on building resources and connecting people in local and regional ways. And somewhat accidentally, that has been my focus for the last about 9 years or so, is working at the local and regional level. I've been since 2015, I've been with the Baltimore Roundtable for Economic Democracy, which is a local loan fund, part of the Seed Commons non-extractive loan network. And the Baltimore Roundtable is made up mostly of current and former worker owners. And so a loan fund that is staffed by experienced worker owners providing assistance. Part of our lending model is we provide what we call high touch assistance, intensive assistance, as well as non-extractive lending to startup worker co-ops and existing worker co-ops. And I, along with one of my colleagues there at the Baltimore Roundtable, last year we mounted what we called an advanced cooperator training, which was very similar to the Dawn training. We took experienced worker owners and also people from startups, and we put them through a 6-month training program so that they would have deeper, broader understanding of how co-op development happens, what the current state of the art is as best as we can determine it, and very intentionally cultivating mutual aid connections between the co-ops that these people came from. And so we're now in the process of chasing funding and trying to mount a second term for that, but it has really helped to jumpstart this network of worker co-ops where we want to jumpstart mutual aid between these worker co-ops in Baltimore. 14, 15, 16 new worker co-ops in Baltimore in the last 9 years as a result of this loan fund that also delivers high-touch assistance. I think that's where the future is, and or at least it's a big part of our future. Another thing I did last year was in New York City. The Cooperative Economics Alliance of New York City, scenic. They staged a cross-sector training that went on for 6 months. Cross-sector training, they got about 20 different co-ops, members of 20 different co-ops in the room, actively cultivating mutual aid connections while integrated into an advanced cooperator training, scaling up to a larger solidarity economy vision, not focused only specifically on worker co-ops, but all types of co-ops, and how co-ops in different sectors can collaborate. And so a different kind of advanced cooperator training, but again, integrated with a mutual aid network development model. So I feel strongly that instead of trying to recreate another national organization, we should look at this natural, what I think is a natural groundswell. As we have more worker co-ops in this country, that means there's the possibility of building greater concentrations of worker co-ops in local areas. And that means that mutual aid networks in local areas, I think, are better positioned now than they are in the past to muster the funding, mount the trainings. And of course, we need to network the different regional and local efforts. So there is a need for a national network. But I think in order to avoid the, you could say, the sort of top-heavy approach that undermined Dawn's existence, we should really, really focus on bottom up. We should be very focused on strengthening the grassroots at the local and regional network, at the local and regional level, and networking those efforts and supporting those efforts in a more of a decentralized network fashion. Thoughts about that, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you really kind of hit it. We're talking right now. One of our board members has been talking with us about community-based development and what that looks like, and we are really interested in mentoring people and helping to train people to be co-op developers. So especially within the tribal nation community, we have a number of nations in Washington and Oregon, but also other groups that are so I guess the idea being that especially we don't want to be extractive of communities by coming in and offer fee for service. I think what we want to do is for those communities, especially for BIPOC communities, is being there to help train their community members to be delivering the cooperative development services and support them, not just coming in to do a project and then leaving. And I think that's more and more.
Amen.
People are talking about that now, and I think that's one of the ways that the current development community can really support this work.
Amen. Amen to that. Inadvertent extractiveness is a big problem. It really is. We shouldn't, and there used to be a lot more tension with the nonprofit industrial complex 10, 15 years ago. GEO talked about this a lot. I feel like that's mitigated some as we've identified and partnered with allies, nonprofit allies who get it, who are sensitive to questions of agency. And then there's people like John, who comes from 25 years on a worker co-op, and now you're running a co-op development center, right? Yeah. So, we used to fear being colonized by the nonprofit world in some ways, and maybe that happened to a certain extent. But also what's happening is the worker co-op world is colonizing the nonprofit world in some ways. And for better or worse, I think it's not a perfect solution, but the reality is, resources are still scarce, okay? And if we're not going to exploit ourselves terribly, we need to be able to pay people for a lot of their time, if not all of their time. And so resources are a huge question in terms of how we go forward, but I really feel strongly that we need to emphasize, supporting local and regional efforts. And if we want to have a nationally coordinated approach, it should be focused on supporting local and regional efforts and, minding that extractive dynamic and, let's help the local folks make it happen as opposed to trying to do it ourselves. And then, so I'm leading as a co-op developer, I'm leaning more into a train the trainer model, as opposed to doing more development myself. I'm focusing more on helping people become those developers, helping worker owners become peer advisors, and even staying in their worker co-ops, but providing assistance. So, I'm biased, of course, but I really believe in that model. Good to join. Good to see you, Chris. Glad you're with us. So let me see. I want to make sure we answered all the questions out there. I hope that I wasn't, Hazel, we weren't able to give you a great answer about training, because outside of Cooperation Works, outside of St. Mary's, I'm not sure we have a solid training resource, a one-stop place to go for worker co-op development training, peer advisor training. What instead we have is maybe a number of regional efforts. But I don't know. I'm open to that discussion. I think we should focus on cultivating resources to support local and regional training, where you can be face to face, and you don't have to fly people around the country in order to get them together face to face. So that's my thoughts, and I'm sure there's other things out there that we can do that I haven't thought of yet. But if anybody has asked a question that they feel hasn't been answered, please do put it in the chat again. Chris, any thoughts? We're not hearing you. You don't appear to be muted, but we're not hearing you. All right. Josh, any thoughts? Apologies for my background noise. I'm trying to silence that, if anybody's hearing my background noise. Okay, it's I think we have maybe up to 14 minutes left in our session. Josh may have some closing housekeeping he needs to do. I don't know, but we're definitely inviting any other questions or thoughts, anything we did not adequately respond to. Hi, this is Q&A time.
Well, I think one was about what would if Dawn had continued, what would things look like? And,
oh yes.
And I guess it's, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think, if it continued and was properly funded, I think it could, I think would have had a even bigger impact. I think one of the things we've seen since 2018, of course, is the legal landscape for worker ownership has changed dramatically with the passage of the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, the Work Act, and which still hasn't been properly funded either. But and now there's the new bill for national worker co-op development that Ro Khanna put in, introduced into Congress. And so, there's I think just to have that organization have been there during that time, I think would have been really dynamic. Also, since 2018, I believe now 5 states have created state-level employee ownership commissions. The one in Washington, both in Washington, of course, has both now a new Center for Employee Ownership and a Employee Ownership Commission. And we definitely took a role in making sure the co-ops got equal treatment with ESOPs.
Right.
But that isn't always the case, because in most states, the employee ownership centers are pretty much dominated in the ESOP world. And so I think that's something that Dawn could have been there to, and its members could have been there to really help push getting more of an equal footing and in that space.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. It is a very intriguing idea. I can't help thinking, with a bit of a broken heart, that if Dawn had kept going, we would have a much stronger brain trust of assistance, knowledge, experience, ability, skill within the worker co-op community itself. Yeah. I do think that's happening organically anyway, to a certain extent, and that's the good news, right? We've got more co-ops, we've got more people more experienced in the co-ops, and so it's happening. But I think it would have accelerated, but again, the trend I see in a number of different ways is we're in a better position now to have local and regional federations, local and regional funders. I've had a very interesting experience. You know, the Baltimore organization I work with, the Baltimore Roundtable for Economic Democracy, they're a founding member of the Seed Commons Network. And so I've been able to sit in a couple times a week on different network calls, and they are a national network of peer funds. And their idea is they generally don't, the national organization generally doesn't do direct loans. They loan money through local entities, local loan funds that aspire to be co-op run funds. And they're still very much a startup. Most of their funds are still in a startup phase, but there's in excess of 40 local funds in the United States now that are providing non-extractive loans. And I have had the chance to, on a number of occasions, to actually work with their loan paperwork. And it is remarkable because they genuinely seem to be non-extractive. They don't want co-ops making loan payments until the co-ops are turning net revenue. They're like, don't make a payment on your loan if it's going to put you into the red. And so it's a fascinating model, and it's still in development. You know, I think it is a model that is in the process of proving itself. But it's a loan fund of tens of millions of dollars in this loan fund now. And so the relevant thing to this discussion is these 40 plus local loan funds around the country that are getting grant money, that are making non-extractive loan funds available to worker co-ops and other types of community-owned organizations. And they represent local allies to co-ops, important local lending allies. And those of us who go far enough back in this movement can remember when your worker co-op just could not get a loan, okay? You could not get a loan without personal guarantees, without putting your personal assets, your house on the line. And, you know, it's remarkable how much more funding, both grant funding as well as loan funding, is much more available now than it was 15 years ago. And again, this funding is now available, much more available at the local level. And so again, there's the zeitgeist I see is more and more strength, more and more power and empowerment being focused at local levels in terms of funding and in terms of assistance. And these local loan funds are also dedicated to providing high-touch assistance. But we want our co-ops to be soaking up that assistance. We want our co-ops to become the brain trust of that expertise, because who knows what's going to happen to impact investing in the future? Who knows what's going to happen to foundation funding, government funding, all the money that's flowing out of philanthropy and impact investors right now? Who knows how long that fund is going to, that trend is going to last, right? Is it a fad or will it be permanent? I don't know. But we need to strengthen our co-ops and make it so that our co-ops can help other co-ops. I really feel like that's what we need to focus on by whatever means we can. A couple questions came up in the chat. I hope somebody else caught them because I missed them. I was too busy flapping my jaw.
Hey, I just hopped on because Josh lost power, and he wanted to make sure there was something here to end the stream when y'all are ready.
Okay.
Let me know. That's why I hopped on.
Okay.
Josh was out in rural Montana. Josh is in rural Montana, and he lost his power. But Chris, I believe you're in Chicago, and you've still got power, right? So
yeah.
Okay. Thank you for joining and saving the host role. We appreciate that.
So there is a question from MJ. If I were to, it's popping up right now, and you know, I would say,
All right, I got it, Josh.
It probably,
Cool, thanks. Okay.
There's always seems to be more work than time for most development centers or projects. I think it depends where you are. I would say, yeah, probably in, you know, I mean, New York has what, about 100 or so worker co-ops right now. But it's a city of what, 15 million people. So there's probably plenty of work to do in New York City. Olympia, you know, we have about a dozen, and we're a community of 50,000. So maybe, yeah, I would say rural communities, if there's a development center active. But the key thing, I think, for co-op development is is being in the community that you're in. Like even our work, it can be very difficult if we have to, go to Ontario, Oregon for a meeting, because we're going to spend 2 days traveling for a 2-hour meeting. And it's just and not being in the community where you can just kind of walk over to the place and meet in person. Even meeting in Seattle, depending on traffic, that can be a 3-hour drive to go the 65 miles to Seattle. And so, it just, but having people in those locations just can make a huge difference. So I think it's more about, where you want to be, and then building that community and working with that community there is what really makes the value.
Yeah. That's a great answer, John. And I would add to that, I don't think there's any end to the need. And one of the special things about this period right now, in the last 10 years, really, I usually don't have to explain what a worker co-op is. Now people have heard of them, and they're not so skeptical about them. It used to be people were like, oh, that's not workplace democracy. That's not going to work. We don't get that much anymore, right? Instead, people think it's easy. Okay. And they think it's easy to start a worker co-op. And I was like, well, it's actually pretty tough, but yeah, you can do it. But so there's no shortage of need. And right now, funding is easier to get than it's ever been, as far as I can tell. And I don't think anybody should expect that to last. John, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it always goes. We're still waiting to hear if, like, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development is going to be funded this year, because they kind of oversubscribed their funds, and so we're waiting to see what the bishops say. I mean, there is more money, definitely, but it still can be limited. It still can be focused very heavily on rural, not urban. But there's ways of finding it. Conversions can be really, if you have a willing seller who is really engaged and really is mission aligned to do that, then that could make it easier. And yeah, I mean, there's next year is going to be International Year of the Co-ops again, and I think the last one in 2012, I didn't think it was going to be that big a deal, but I think it really did raise the bar, following on the heels of Occupy in 2011, and I think it really catalyzed worker co-ops in this country, and our organizations were there at the perfect time for that, and I think this time we're going to see a similar spike, especially as we're moving, and we have the Department of Labor office now and other things going on in the infrastructure of this country that we're definitely I think it's only going to increase.
Yeah, I hope, and I think that we're experiencing the challenges of a certain amount of success right now, as opposed to the challenges of just not even being recognized or erased. And yes, Rebecca, that's exactly what I was thinking. That's why building self-determination is so important. In the challenge of success, that will be where we need to emphasize, is even well-intentioned allies can inadvertently undermine our agency as autonomous and independent co-ops. And so, yeah. And so that's I think, hopefully that's where we're headed now, is the challenges of success and how to sustain and develop our agency, including our development capacity internally, as we go forward, with governments at the table, and impact investors at the table, and loan funds at the table, and so forth. All kinds of players at the table now. We need to make sure that we're building our own strength internally, as a movement and as co-ops.
Yeah, and I think the real danger of the success of it is other people coming into the so-called employee ownership field, like KKR, with which is how that even gets called employee ownership, I don't know, and other people that are basically trying to use ways of sort of making themselves more of a marketing tool to make themselves not look like extractors, I guess, for lack of a better word. And so we need to really always be out there making sure that co-ops and worker co-ops specifically have a space carved out as being a very real and form of employee ownership or worker ownership.
Workplace democracy. Don't settle for less than workplace democracy.
Right.
That may be my final word, because that's where a lot of these half measures like ESOPs, that's where they seem to lose it, right? And the sort of cultural empowerment and enfranchisement that comes from growing into a workplace democracy, there's just no substitute. We're at 8:30 Eastern time. Adjoa, so I want to be mindful, Chris, that maybe we need to sign off. Adjoa is asking, it seems there's a greater need for co-ops now to organize perhaps unskilled workers to utilize some of that money out there. Yeah, a conversation, unify interests, and explore ideas, both here and in Canada. Well, maybe those are items for the bike rack for us to follow up on. I think those are both big topics in themselves.
Definitely, if people are going to be in Chicago for the National Worker Co-op Conference, I'll be there. I'll be happy to have side conversations about that. I think if there was, interest to revisit what that would look like, and I'd certainly be happy to have that be part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, that's what we like to do in the GEO Collective, is start conversations and ask evocative questions without knowing the answers, of course. So anyway, Chris, do we need to fold it up?
Sure, yeah. Thanks everyone for joining. If this conversation was of value to you, you can donate at geo.coop/donate. And if you want to get involved in GEO, whether it's writing or helping the collective out in other ways, you can, whether you got an article that you want to write on your own, or you want help to write an article, someone else's article, GEO always welcomes volunteers, and you can get in contact through editors@geo.coop. So
awesome.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.